Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Global Leaders Forum, sponsored by the Center for U.S.-Mexican Studies and the Center for Commerce and Diplomacy at the School of Global Policy and Strategy at UC San Diego. Thank you, everyone, for being here today. We're very delighted to have our special guest, Ambassador Christopher Landau, to speak with us today. And of course, the conversation will be hosted by the very gregarious Rafael Fernandez de Castro de Medina, the director of the Center for U.S.-Mexican Studies. So I'm Renee Bowen, the director of the Center for Commerce and Diplomacy. And at the Center for Commerce and Diplomacy, our aim is to advance global economic cooperation, and we do this by hosting events such as this, where we interact with some of the world's leaders and help to understand the policy framework around agreements such as the USMCA and other international agreements and institutions. And we do this also through our research and through our networking. So we're very delighted to be part of this event today. And I just want to share a little bit about the center's work and where we're heading. We're a very new center. We started in about 2019, but we've already had great success. And as part of this Global Leaders Forum, we've hosted Condoleezza Rice, the Prime Minister of Jamaica, and now we're delighted to have Ambassador Landau today. Tomorrow, we have the pleasure of also hosting Bob Zoellick, the former president of the World Bank and USTR. So I am not going to take a lot of time because this is going to be a very thrilling discussion, and I'd very much like to hear what Ambassador Landau has to say. I'm going to hand it over to Rafael for his opening remarks and also to introduce properly Ambassador Landau. Rafael, please take it away.
Thank you, Renee. I'm Rafael Fernandez de Castro. I'm the director of the Center for U.S.-Mexican Studies at UC San Diego, and I would like to welcome you all to this conference. This conference is on supply chains and the USMCA, the first year we're celebrating it. And I will say the Center of U.S.-Mexican Relations at UCSD, our ultimate goal is to facilitate the process of integration between Mexico and the U.S. So you can all understand that this conference is essential to what we do. So thank you, Chris Landau, for accepting our invitation. And I will say, before I introduce properly Chris, let me share with you and let me thank you all. This is, I would say, teamwork at its best. Thank you, Renee Bowen, and thank you to the entire staff of the Center for Commerce and Diplomacy for putting this together with us. Thank you, Lawrence Bross, the co-director of the center. Thank you, Kale Handley. You have been essential for creating this. And thank you, the entire staff of the Center for Commerce and Diplomacy and our center, because it's, again, this is teamwork at its best. I would also like to say that Daisy Alfaro, a first-year student at GPS, is helping me hosting this event and helping me chairing the session. Daisy, would you like to introduce yourself briefly, and then I will properly introduce Chris Landau.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Daisy Alfaro, and I am a graduate student at GPS at UC San Diego. I am a Master of International Affairs, and I have a focus on international politics and Latin America. Welcome.
Thank you, Daisy. It is my honor to introduce to you Ambassador Christopher Landau. He served as the U.S. Ambassador to Mexico from 2019 to 2021. During his tenure at the U.S. largest diplomatic mission in the world, Christopher Landau was able to get the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement enter into force. Ambassador Landau also helps safeguard critical regional supply chains and lead innovative public diplomacy during the pandemic. And we asked him to tell us his stories, to share with us his experience during that time in today's talk. He, prior to his appointment as ambassador, Christopher Landau practiced law in DC for close to 30 years. He was mostly, for a long time, partner of Kirkland and Ellis LLP, and he briefed and argued cases in the US Supreme Court and the Courts of Appeal. At the beginning of his law career, he served as a law clerk to the US Supreme Court Justices Anthony Scalia and Clarence Thomas. And I believe that Chris is today honoring as well Anthony Scalia. And so thank you for being with us. Chris, I know you were very busy and we appreciate this. He was born into a career Foreign Service family. His father, George W. Landau, was ambassador to Paraguay, Chile, and Venezuela. Needless to say, Christopher Landau has an impeccable Spanish. And I would also say that he was, when he was serving as ambassador, I believe he was the ambassador, the US ambassador who had the largest followers on Twitter. Thank you for being with us. I know you're an enthusiastic of North America, so thank you again, Chris, for joining us. Yours is the floor.
Thank you, Rafael. Thank you for that kind introduction. And let me thank UC San Diego, the School of Global Diplomacy and Strategy, and the Center for U.S.-Mexican Studies, as well as the Center for Commerce and Diplomacy for this invitation. I think one of the things I learned going into government service is that when you're in government service, you often don't have the time to really reflect on problems and issues, and you have to, as they say, drink from a fire hose every day. Particularly as the U.S. ambassador to Mexico, there was always a crisis of the day. And I think it's so important to have this kind of event that takes a step back and thinks about where we can go and hopefully comes up with recommendations for policymakers. Because the policy, it was very interesting for me coming from my legal background where I had time and my job consisted of analyzing cases, reading, studying cases in depth. When I was ambassador, it was go, go, go. And it's a very important function, I think, to come up with ideas and to do the thinking that policymakers, unfortunately, don't have the time to do. I want to really congratulate the school, the Center for Commerce and Diplomacy. I think commercial relationships are absolutely critical in international relations. And I think it's something that's often overlooked. I think there are sexier topics like human rights and issues like that, political issues that I think tend to draw a lot of people into the space. But as Rafael mentioned, my father was a career Foreign Service officer, and he actually started his career as the commercial attaché at the embassy in Montevideo, Uruguay, back in the late 1950s. He joined under a special program that brought in people with experience in the business sector, in the private sector. And for the rest of his career, he always believed that good commercial relationships between countries were the basis for good political relationships between countries. And I very much took that to heart as ambassador to Mexico, trying to foster the commercial relationships between our countries. I think the economic ties are really the basis and keep the political issues from taking us off the rails. So I want to congratulate the Center for Commerce and Diplomacy for focusing on that link, which I think is so important and, again, often overlooked. One of my father's biggest pet peeves was that the Foreign Commercial Service got moved out of the State Department into the Commerce Department. And he felt very strongly it should remain in the State Department. So I'm afraid I didn't have much luck in getting it moved back in my tenure in government, but we'll see. It still was one of his dying wishes, I think, to see that happen. As Rafael said, I was ambassador to Mexico for almost 2 years at the end of the last administration. And I feel like about 10 years of history got compressed into that 2-year period. We had the USMCA, we had migration dramas, we had the global pandemic, we had lots of drama on the security front. Remember, El Chapo's son was briefly detained. General Cienfuegos was briefly detained. So there was really no shortage of drama in U.S.-Mexico ties during my time there. But today, I'd like to focus on really two of the issues that wound up defining, I think, my tenure. First, the USMCA, and second, the pandemic. And I'll talk you through those issues as I live them briefly, and then maybe talk a little bit about the way they intersect and maybe the path forward from both of those events. First of all, with respect to USMCA, I think it's important to take a step back in U.S.-Mexican relations. And I've been a student of U.S.-Mexican relations for a long time, since I was a student in college. I got a certificate in Latin American studies. This is back in the mid-'80s. And at that point, the book that was kind of the bestseller on U.S.-Mexican relations was called Distant Neighbors. And it's true that for a lot of our history, the U.S. and Mexico basically had our backs to each other. And we're each doing our own thing, but not really looking for ways to take advantage of our geographical proximity, as well as our other ties. I think, we get tied up in the day-to-day events in U.S.-Mexico relations. I don't think we can ever overestimate the importance of an event like NAFTA, which, for its flaws, was really, I think, a watershed in bringing the U.S. and Mexico together to be on the same team. And I think that was something that we had never had in our history before. We always, I think, felt like we were on different teams and sometimes rival teams. And I think it's very important that perception, just at a high level of generality, that was accompanied by much larger migration than we had historically witnessed in the 90s and the early 2000s. And I think all these factors together have kind of ushered in a new era in U.S.-Mexican relations, where now the leading book is called Vanishing Frontiers. We have so much in common now. And in fact, as those of you on the call may know, Mexico is sometimes our largest trading partner, but certainly in the top 2 or 3 all the time. The places kind of vary between Mexico, China, and Canada. But I think there's a lot of potential there for Mexico to be number one and remain number one, given the geographical proximity. But let me say, a few years ago, things were not looking very promising. President Trump, as is well known, campaigned on a promise to get rid of NAFTA. President Lopez Obrador similarly comes from a very free trade skeptical background, where neoliberalism is kind of considered to be a bad word. And so I think things were not looking particularly promising. As folks may recall, there were pretty intense negotiations during the early part of the Trump time. The truth is, NAFTA was, whatever you think of NAFTA, it was ready for a do-over. The world has changed a lot in the past 30 years. And, fortunately, I think people in all 3 countries realized that, we were stronger together than separate on these issues. And I think all sides made some compromises, and we wound up with a treaty that basically, kept the basic NAFTA framework, tweaked it, certainly made improvements. But, I think, again, the important thing is to retain this framework that creates North America as a free trade zone. I know that Bob Zellick will be speaking tomorrow about the idea of North America, and I think that's a very interesting topic. But again, just to take a step back, I think one of the things we have to recognize is how implausible it might have seemed originally that we would get this free trade agreement with President Trump in the United States and President Lopez Obrador in Mexico. And yet it happened. And I think that's ultimately because the realities of the benefits of free trade, or that the trade agreement has brought, are too strong to overlook. So again, I think it's a very good event that it happened. But I think we're going to have to see how it works out in practice. Frankly, there's a lot of the mechanics still to be worked out. It has brand new provisions on labor, for instance. That was a very big concern on the American side, to make sure we really have an even playing field. And it's really a bipartisan concern. I remember, I had some of the leading Democratic congressional leaders come down to Mexico City when I was ambassador, and made it very clear that they are expecting Mexico to implement its new labor laws, with all due vigor, and we'll see how that plays out. Again, the agreement can become a source of tension and friction insofar as it obliges each of the countries to do certain things that they otherwise may not want to do. So just like any agreement, there is always some degree of international obligation that may wind up being domestically unpopular with particular constituencies. So we'll see how that goes. I think just to think about the timeline a little bit, it was ratified in the House in December of 2019, the Senate January of 2020. The Mexican Congress ratified it around the same time, again, by very lopsided margins in both countries, which was a real difference from NAFTA. Canada wound up ratifying it on March 13th, 2020. And if you remember the timeline last year, that was the week that the world started to stop with the pandemic. And so that kind of leads us into the second part of what I want to talk about, which is the pandemic. In early 2020, we started to read reports in the media about this virus in China. And I remember, reading stories about Mexicans who were stranded in China and, in Wuhan, where there was the first lockdown. And I was trying to be helpful in getting them repatriated to Mexico, see if I could get any American, relief flights to include some of the Mexicans. And, before we knew it, it had spread around the world. And all of a sudden, a month later, we were all in Wuhan, so to speak. And I remember in mid-March, I think the World Health Organization declared a pandemic around March 11th or so. My wife could see the writing on the wall better than I, and said, well, I think this is a time for us to take a long weekend and get out of town, because we may not be able to in the future. So we went to Puebla. There was a puente in Mexico, a bridge holiday for Benito Juarez's birthday. And we got out of town to Puebla. And I remember already then feeling uncomfortable going into restaurants, where there was just a lot of people. And it was definitely a strange feeling, because none of us knew how contagious this was or how dangerous this was. And, as I did, I posted some images on social media and got criticism, like, why are you going out to a restaurant? It's a pandemic. And at that point, there was only about 10 cases in Mexico. Mexico was, far behind the United States originally in terms of the number of cases. But I remember during that week, I had a speech planned, about 400 people. And as I was on the way there, the Israeli ambassador called me and says, I won't be able to attend your speech because I've gotten instructions from my government that we're not to go to any large events. And so I kind of knew that, things were about to change. When I got back from that long weekend on Monday evening, went into the office the following day, Tuesday, the 17th of March, I think that was, and basically conferred with my team, and we decided that we were going to close down the mission to all but essential personnel the following day. So it all happened very, very suddenly. And from my point of view, the most dramatic part of this came when I got a call later that day that Canada was going to be closing its land border with the United States, and that we had to kind of figure out what we're going to do with the Mexican land border. Again, this was virtually overnight this was happening. And, I think people in Washington were very clear, and I agreed that, we didn't want to close the border because of the volume of commerce. And so, I talked to my contacts at the Mexican Foreign Ministry, wound up going over there late that night, about 10 o'clock at night, and had meetings with the foreign minister and his team. And we decided the headline was going to be border remains open to essential activity, to commerce. That was never really a consideration to close that, because it's too important to both countries. But we did agree to limit the non-essential travel. These border communities are very integrated, and there's a lot of traffic, as you all know, particularly in the San Diego region. We're going to limit non-essential travel for the time being. Again, where nobody knew what was going to be happening or what how dangerous this virus really was. At that point, it was much more widespread in the United States than in Mexico. But it was interesting because we announced this agreement with Mexico, and I think the newspapers were predicting chaos at the border. I think they just have a standard narrative that whenever anything happens that affects the border, the immediate headline is chaos at the border. And so some of the newspapers actually ran the next morning with a chaos at the border narrative. And it was kind of funny because other ones ran with actual photos showing that the border was almost deserted. I think at that point, people had just decided that they weren't going to try to cross at that particular moment. So it's kind of a surreal moment followed in the next week or so when things in the United States were pretty shut down. But in Mexico, they were just starting to shut down. At the end of March, Mexico issued a decree of the Ministry of Health that shut down all but essential industries across the country. And essential industries was defined very narrowly to be basically medical, transportation, and food. And this was became a real issue very quickly because the United States had a patchwork of 50 different essential industries regimes. It was a state level issue in the United States, and they were different from each other, and they were different from Mexico. And so we had industries in the United States that were considered essential, where their counterparts in Mexico were not considered essential. And again, as those of you who have studied or are familiar with U.S.-Mexico commerce, you know that there's a huge back and forth commerce of components. In fact, I didn't realize how integrated the U.S. and Mexican economies were really until the pandemic. Because let me tell you, starting in April of 2020, my mailbox just exploded with emails from American companies, CEOs, from big companies to small and medium companies saying, we're going to have to close and we're allowed to be open if we don't get the parts from Mexico. And, by hook or by crook, we were able to talk to our Mexican counterparts really at the federal level and at the state and local levels as well. Even though the definition of essential industries in Mexico was done at the federal level, the federal government allowed the state and local governments some degree of discretion in enforcing it and implementing it. And so we were able to address some of these issues. And to my knowledge, not a single American factory that was otherwise allowed to operate in the United States was forced to close because of a lack of components from Mexico. So, I was pleased by that, but I have to say it was a little bit seat of the pants. And I think U.S.-Mexico commerce has outstripped our institutional capabilities. And I very much hope that one of the lessons of this pandemic is that we have some kind of a constantly operating or existing working group to handle supply chains. I think one of the things we realize now, all of a sudden supply chains are sexy, right? You open the front page of the newspaper, what do you have on the front? Is supply chain stories. That's pretty new, but it's really important. And this is where I'd like to loop back to USMCA, because I think USMCA gives us a framework to do that. I think these supply chains that have been created between our countries are absolutely vital to both our economies. One of the things that was interesting is that I got some statistics during the pandemic that if the U.S.-Mexico border were closed to commercial activity, the trucks and all that the U.S. economy would go into recession in less than a week. So the Mexico commercial links are absolutely critical to the U.S. economy. And we haven't even mentioned some of the labor issues. I got a call the day that the embassy, shut down a lot of its functions, for the Secretary of Agriculture saying, well, I hope you guys are still going to be processing the visas for the temporary agricultural workers who are absolutely essential to preserving the United States food supply. And we were able to do that. But again, these are issues that require some care. And I think particularly on the supply chain front, it's irresponsible for us not to set up a mechanism now of people that know about supply chains and have some kind of a game plan for how you protect them in the event of some disruption. It gets to be very problematic because, we would ask American companies sometimes, well, who's your supplier? And you might think it's easy, right? Because you might think they'll tell you, well, it's, Gomez y Compañía or some, one specific Mexican company. But oftentimes it's multiple companies. And then each of those companies, of course, in Mexico has its own supply chain, right? So if you open Gomez y Compañía, well, Gomez y Compañía needs the widgets from Hernandez. And so sometimes I would ask people if they were complaining that, they needed their components. I would say, okay, well, how many businesses do you need to remain open in Mexico to supply you? And sometimes they would say, 127. So well, that's asking for a lot. I think the reality of modern business and commerce is that people don't like to have huge inventories of parts. I think everything is kind of immediate logistics and immediate delivery, which is all fine and good, but it creates an incredible vulnerability to a supply chain disruption. And, I think we're seeing that now. Let me just take a step back, though, to my broader message is that, I think the USMCA in the pandemic, as well as kind of political developments at the broad global level more generally, and by that I mean the disengagement between the U.S. and China that started really under the Trump administration, but I think is just going to be a regular feature now of American policy on a bipartisan basis. I think have all aligned to create a golden moment for commercial relationships between the U.S. and Mexico. I think it is clear that the supply chain with China is very problematic. And I'm very concerned that policymakers in the U.S. and Mexico are blowing this, I think, unique window of opportunity. And I think we need to have a game plan for how to lure back companies, particularly manufacturing companies that have gone to the Far East in recent decades, in the last 20 years, back to North America. Unfortunately, I don't see that happening right now. I don't see any kind of organized strategy to do that. I mean, take the pharmaceutical industry, for example. I think it is clear that it is very problematic for so much of the U.S. and Mexican pharmaceutical supply chain to be over in China for many reasons. So again, what are we doing to, sit down and with the manufacturers who are over there and say, what does it take to bring you back to North America, whether it be the United States or Mexico? We need a game plan. And it's very frustrating to me that so many of the headlines on U.S.-Mexico commercial ties these days are negative, with particularly with the Mexican government's energy agenda. Negative stories have been dominating the headlines. And, this is exactly the time when you're also seeing headlines about the ships backed up in Long Beach, that we should have great stories about reshoring or nearshoring or whatever you want to call it. But, there's a lot of talk about this. And, I guess I'm contributing to this talk right now. But we have got to have an action plan to say, this is what we're going to do, because this window is not going to be open forever. I think these companies, if they leave China, they're going to go to Vietnam or India. And I feel like, we don't want to blow this opportunity. And I don't see any kind of organized efforts right now. I mean, I was certainly trying to encourage my Mexican counterparts to, have this dialogue with us and really, come up with a concrete program. But I think that's going to involve people from the US government, people from the Mexican government, and people from the private sector. I think it's important, people in the private sector probably know best of all, what they can do. And, I think it's important to create a place where that dialogue can happen, because, I just worry that both the US and Mexico have very large bureaucracies and they don't talk to each other very much. And it's very difficult to get any kind of significant change or movement unless there is a clear signal from the top. And I'm hoping that happens, but I hope that this group can certainly do what it can. I would certainly like to do what I can to keep beating this drum, because I don't think that we're going to have this unique confluence of factors again soon to really build up this relationship. And in a lot of ways, I think the biggest victim, in a sense, of the rise of China has been Mexico. I think a lot of what the business that went to China would have gone to Mexico, if China had not been as successful as it has been over the past 20 years. And I think, we have a moment now to try to redress that. And my message today is that I hope we take advantage of that opportunity. So thanks again for giving me this forum to speak to all of you. It's a real pleasure. And this is a pretty urgent message, and I hope folks take it to heart. I think it's important both for the U.S.-Mexican Center and for the Center for Commerce and Diplomacy. Again, Mexico, a lot of Americans don't really think of Mexico as a critical economic and commercial partner. I think of it as a vacation spot. I think it's really important for Americans, and particularly those in policy circles, just to understand how important Mexico is as an economic and commercial partner. So pleased to be a part of this dialogue, and thanks for the invitation.
Thank you, Chris, for this, for sharing with us your experiences, and thank you for being so candid on your ideas and on your criticisms, because yes, I do believe that the opportunity is there, and this is the time to take advantage of it. Let me remind all of you, the idea is now to have a dialogue with Chris Landau. So please send your questions to the Q&A bottom. We'll be very pleased to read your questions to Chris Landau. And why don't we start with you, Daisy Alfaro? Do you have a question for Ambassador Landau?
Yes, I actually do. So Ambassador Landau, you mentioned having some issues or facing some issues during the pandemic. You touched on supply chains. But what would you say was the biggest challenge that you faced as an ambassador during the pandemic?
I think that was the biggest challenge. That of course came completely out of nowhere. I knew going into the job, for instance, that we were going to have challenges on migration, on security, and sure enough, those were challenges. I think where something just came complete out of left field was in the pandemic. And, these supply chains have been created over, 15, 20 years. And it was very scary to me. I respect the work of so many people who have put time and effort into building those kind of relationships. And I said to my Mexican colleagues, it's your country, you're a sovereign country, but let me tell you, if you don't try to protect these supply chains, they'll be gone, and then they won't come back. And of course, when the pandemic started, it's easy now with 2020 hindsight to criticize people, and again, it was a little bit unfortunate from my point of view that the Mexican government put the health ministry in charge of deciding what were essential economic activities in Mexico. Mexico has an economy ministry, but again, I'm not being critical here, because I think people then were very unsure of how to handle this. But the truth is, the health ministry had no sense of supply chains. And I think realistically, this was a moment where, I was getting these phone calls kind of panicked from U.S. businesses saying, we're going to have to shut down our operations in the United States if we don't get these components from Mexico. And, I would sometimes call the different ministries in Mexico and contacts, and it was not always clear that we were going to be able to, accommodate these requests. And I feel that we need some institution, or sometimes I would call different ministries, and sometimes we worked with governors. One of the things that really I thought Mexico did well in the pandemic was rely on its federalism to actually give powers to the governors, because different states were facing different health crises at different time. And if you've been following Mexico, they had different semáforos with stoplights with different health conditions. And I think it was useful to have some flexibility built into the system. But in a sense, Mexico and the United States were a little bit lucky because we were at the tail end of the pandemic worldwide. So it started in China, spread across to Europe. And so there was already some models of how you could reopen economic activity in a way that, took into consideration the health concerns, which were very legitimate. Nobody wanted to have a situation where you said you're going to open these factories and then there'd be a huge outbreak and then they'd have to be shut down. So, we were all operating a little bit in the dark. But, I think as we look back at this, I think it is clear that, we probably erred on the side of caution, which is okay. When you don't really know what you're facing. But again, I'm calling publicly now, as I've called publicly before, for the establishment of some kind of a commission with representatives of both the United States and Mexico. So at least if this kind of a thing happens, I don't have to be calling, the governor of Chihuahua to try to work it out, or the governor of Puebla, or the secretary of this or that, or the undersecretary, that we at least have a mechanism of people who understand the supply chains and can say, okay, this company should continue to operate, and that one, does not need to. It's very difficult, but that was for me the most dramatic moment of my time as ambassador.
Rafael, if I may.
Please go ahead, Renee, of course.
We're getting some wonderful questions in the chat, and I'd like to pick up on one of the themes I am noticing here. By the way, thank you so much for the great discussion you had. It's clearly having an impact already. So one of the things you just mentioned is this opportunity for nearshoring or reshoring, and thinking about how to capture some of that for Mexico. A number of questions in the chat are of the flavor of what do you think is preventing that? So if there was to be an economic opportunity, businesses would likely make that move themselves. So there must be some sort of friction that is preventing that move. What do you see as those frictions? And how do you see us moving forward from those? And I will just kind of put one more spin on this, which is one of my observations, the differences in human capital and institutions. So a lot of these Asian economies have certainly different training to make them capable for doing, for example, biotech or pharmaceutical productivity, versus Mexico doesn't necessarily have that well-developed human capital. I could be wrong there, but would love to hear your remarks on that.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I did a fair amount of visiting factories in Mexico. During the pandemic, in order to preserve these supply chains, I started calling publicly for companies to be allowed to reopen as long as they followed the appropriate health guidance, with masking and social distancing. I think, as I mentioned before, we learned from other parts of the world that that's not impossible. And I felt it was incumbent on me not just to talk the talk, but to walk the walk. And so I actually embarked on a pretty aggressive tour of Mexico and visiting factories. And I think people would be surprised at the number of very high-tech factories in Mexico, from automotive components. I mean, I think the engines for GM trucks of all North America are manufactured in Chihuahua, Mexico. Some areas where you would think the Far East would have an advantage for the reasons you mentioned. And I would talk to the factory managers, and a lot of them had experience in factories in China and the Far East, and they said the quality of workers and their attention to detail and quality control was actually better in Mexico than in China. That's just anecdotal evidence, but I think it is interesting because I'm basically I think the private sector always will know best what benefits the private sector, and so you would think that there would just be a natural tendency to want to reshore. I do think that it is frustrating to me that the headlines coming out of Mexico in the last several years have all been dominated by negative stories in terms of investing in Mexico. And the president there, as he's certainly entitled to do, it's a sovereign country, has an agenda, particularly in the energy sector, where he is not looking to attract a lot of private foreign investment. I would hope that Mexico could maybe message that for other sectors, the door is open, and maybe the answer is focusing on some sectors, maybe like the pharmaceutical sector, for example, where we just need some success stories of big investments coming back to North America. And again, I think the workforce is there. I mean, obviously, security considerations are important. Mexico, has I think a somewhat mixed reputation on that front. I think that's, again, important for people who are actually doing business there. I mean, I said this to the Mexicans. I think your best bet is to get companies that already have operations in Mexico and in China to talk about what it's like doing business in Mexico. And my sense is that people have a good experience. And I think it's important for the United States government too to say we are not neutral in this challenge between let's say the Far East and North America. We have an interest, I think, in that nearshoring. I mean, again, just look at what's happening outside the port of Long Beach these days. And I would hope that we could try together. I think we need to talk to companies and say, and really ask the question you asked: what does it take to, why don't you want to come to Mexico? Is it, a question of the workforce? Because let me say that, there are very highly educated, there are pockets of Mexico, certainly, that are very 21st century. Again, Mexico's a big country, as is China, as the United States. But, Guadalajara is a real tech hub, Monterrey. A lot of these places have great universities. And, I think, again, you have different levels of companies that might need different levels of workers. I mean, you might need factory workers, you might need engineers. My sense is that Mexico has a very good story to tell. And I think it's important that we have, discussions between Mexican officials, U.S. officials, and the private sector to really hash out that question. What does it take? But I think the people who should know the best are the companies that are doing business in Mexico presently. And they should share their, what is good about that and the frustrations they have. And hopefully the Mexican government can say, okay, we hear you and we will try to address those frustrations and, therefore encourage other people to come.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Rene. Daisy, there's quite a few questions in the Q&A. Why don't you read some of them to Ambassador Landau, please?
Yes, of course. There is a question from Juan Pablo Cervantes, and he says, Ambassador Landau, Thanks for an excellent presentation. I totally agree that private sector participation is essential for strengthening supply chains and for nearshoring purposes. There are various groups and associations speaking on both sides of the border. Give me just 1 second. Could we contact you to discuss? I participate in the COMCE and CCE. Thanks again.
I'm delighted. I'll speak wherever I'm invited. I feel very strongly about this issue because I think ultimately this is a win-win proposition for our countries. I don't think that it's a zero-sum game by any means. And I think, again, as I said, this is a golden opportunity now that I think the playing field with China has not been a level playing field. I think that's changing. And I think the pandemic and all the supply chain disruptions attendant to the pandemic are even underscoring that further. So, I think we just need to drill down into this. If you're a company that has been relying on China's supply chains and you are, seeing this delay at the ports, what is it going to take for you to say, we'd rather have this in Mexico? And again, I think, Renee hit on the key question, which is, what is stopping businesses from doing that? And, again, the current administration in Mexico has, again, with the exception of the energy sector, I think, tried to, has certainly expressed an interest in attracting private investment in Mexico. I think they need that, right? I mean, the government there, the president there is very cautious fiscally. He's not spending money that they don't have in Mexico. He's probably one of the most cautious fiscal leaders in the whole world. But that means the money has to come from somewhere. And so I think, the answer is private investment. And so the question is, how do you lure private investment? And, I think there are some companies where, it might make more sense for them to come to the United States for their operations. There's some that it might make more sense in Mexico. Certainly I think you raise a good point about the workforce, but again, my sense is that, Mexico's workforce will stand up very well against China's, certainly. The U.S., again, I think the U.S. and Mexican economies are in many ways complementary rather than competitive. And, again, I think if there's companies that could come back to the U.S., I mean, from a U.S. perspective, that's obviously better. But if they're not going to come back to the U.S., it seems to me that it's better for them to be in Mexico for many reasons than in China. So again, to answer your question, if any group wants to have me expound my views on this, I'm, just reach out. I'm delighted to do that.
Daisy, there's quite a few other questions. Could you read the 2 or 3 of them to Ambassador Landau?
Yes, of course.
And then I will have to ask you, Chris, a little bit about immigration, even though it's not the topic in this panel, but I believe is the elephant in the room in U.S.-Mexican relations nowadays. So go ahead, Daisy, and I will come back.
Okay, we have a question from Beatriz Leisegui. She's asking, she says that the problem in leaving the decisions to the state governments in Mexico has been an issue so far. And in the United States and Canada, states have a greater power to take decisions than Mexican states. The federal governments only provide guidance. How do you coordinate better federal and state governments of the 3 countries?
That's really a very, I think, important question. I think it is, I'm a constitutional lawyer by training, and I think one of the benefits of the United States, and Canada too, for that reason, even more so, is a system of federalism where you don't have all the power centralized in one place. I think that's a healthy thing for liberty generally, to have power dispersed. And I mean political power, economic power, and Mexico is a federal republic as well. It's the Estados Unidos Mexicanos. But I think in practice, as Beatriz correctly notes, it has not had a strong federal system for some time historically. And, that you kind of understand that when you look back to the 20th century and the monopoly on power that the PRI party enjoyed during that period. And basically everybody was on the same team. And so I think the orders tended to come from Mexico City. I think nowadays you see, a lot of states are governed by parties other than the party governing in Mexico City. And I think that creates a lot of opportunities for, states to do things differently than the national government. I think that can generally be a healthy thing for a society to have different models. I mean, in our country, we often look to the states as laboratories of democracy. And I think the pandemic is a great example where there is not a one-size-fits-all answer to a lot of these questions. And I think it is a healthy development for Mexico to have more power diffused at the state and local level. But it is a difficult comparison because a lot of the money for the Mexican states comes from Mexico City, whereas in the United States, states have their own taxing powers, and as long as the states in Mexico are dependent on the purse strings of the federal government, it's hard to have true independence. But certainly as ambassador, I thought one of the most important things I could do, and I really learned this during the pandemic, was have relations at the state level. And I actually got on the phone with all of the state governors, except for one, during the course of the pandemic, just to ask, are there, things that we can be helpful to, or what, how do you see things in your state? And I think those are important relationships, and I think it's going to strengthen our country the more layers of contact we have. And I think it's great if state governors or local officials want to try to work with each other. I think that will only make our relationship stronger.
Thank you for the ambassador.
Yes, Daisy, go ahead.
We have one more question from Lawrence Bros, and he says, in light of perhaps long-run bottlenecks in ocean shipping from Asia, do supply chains in Mexico that use rail and trucking have an edge on transportation cost and reliability?
Well, that's an important question, and one of my frustrations in Mexico was sometimes with reliability issues. There's a very important rail line that connects the port of Lázaro Cárdenas on the coast of Michoacán with the Central Highlands in Mexico City, and you would get sometimes just a bunch of radical splinter groups from teachers' unions that would just put a couple of people on the rail lines and stop the railway. And again, whatever one thinks of political protest, it seems to me that it's not appropriate to disrupt a country's economic arteries. And if you give that power to one or two people, that's a very dangerous situation. So I think, again, Mexico has to show that its supply lines are safe. I mean, there is a good railway network extending down from the United States into Mexico. There are important trucking connections as well, but there certainly are issues there. I mean, there are security issues. I mean, sometimes you hear trucks get hijacked. Again, I think these are the kinds of issues that people have to talk about very candidly, and a company has to say, "Look, I would come to Mexico, but I can't be sure that if my factory is in Guanajuato and I'm sending my stuff up to the U.S. border in Laredo, that the truck won't get hijacked. And what assurances can you give me, or that somebody won't block the railway lines?" And again, I think if Mexico wants to play in the big leagues economically with the United States and China, it has to be able to give assurances on that front. If they're not willing or able to do that, then I don't think this is going to work. I think it is dependent on that. And I think, that's really a question for the Mexicans to answer, because these are questions within their own sovereignty of how they handle, these kind of potential disruptions. But it is not going to work if Mexico does not is not in a position to make guarantees on those things.
Thank you, Chris. There's quite a few questions on immigration, but let me ask you this, Chris. Some of us, we fear that with Biden coming into the White House and with the change of narrative regarding migration, that might create some crisis in the US-Mexico border. And indeed, there's a crisis there. The numbers we're listening to it, they huge. I believe the number of apprehensions in the US-Mexico border are at all-time high. So you were dealing with this, and I believe the issue has politicized. The Republicans are attacking Democrats and the other way around. What will you do? What will be a meaningful way to deal with this, Chris? Because indeed, I mean, we're having people coming into the border that they fear in violence. Some others are coming here because they know there's very good jobs in the US, and the US economy now badly needs the Mexicans, the Central Americans. So, I mean, what will be your take on this? And Daisy, there's quite a few questions. Could you read another question to Ambassador Landau, and then we'll give him the floor. And with that, I believe after that, we could go back to Rene Bowie.
Okay, yeah, for sure. There is a question from Judo Garcia Lata, and he says, regarding immigration policy, how intertwined are the conversations between the US and Mexico?
Let me say this, migration is a huge issue. And I think Rafael really hit the nail on the head that there's a lot of win-win situations for immigration. I mean, we need a certain amount of labor in the United States, as we're seeing now. I mean, I think you can't go out without seeing signs. At McDonald's, they're hiring people for, I don't know, more than $15 an hour. These are huge sums for Mexico and other parts of the world. And I think the question here really requires distinguishing between legal and illegal immigration. And I think the answer is we need to encourage legal immigration, incentivize legal immigration, and disincentivize and discourage illegal migration. I mean, it's as simple as that. And I'm afraid what this administration has done is to send a message that illegal migration is okay. And I think it's not. And once that message gets out, it's very difficult to put that genie back in the bottle. I think, though, it's not enough just to have a message of no. And I think this is, again, embedded in your question, Rafael. It's important to have an affirmative strategy, which makes it easier and more flexible for American employers to bring people in. I mean, I think the Bracero program was a big success back in the 40s and 50s and 60s. And a lot of times, Mexicans and people from other parts of the world don't want to come to the United States to live forever. They want to make some good money that they can't make back home and then come back to their country. And I think the current system of illegal migration discourages that, because once you get into the United States, you're trapped here. You can't go back for the abuelita's birthday or to see your wife and children. You have to bring your whole family to the United States if you want to do that. So I think the question really requires, reform on several levels. I think we have to reform the asylum system, which now a lot of people are coming with, bogus claims of asylum, which is a very limited. It should be a very limited kind of law. It's about, a well-founded fear of persecution on the basis of your politics or your religion or your ethnicity. The vast majority of people are coming because of poverty and violence, but those are not grounds for asylum, unless the violence is directed at them because of those things, their race or their politics, which is generally not the case. They're generally just violent neighborhoods. But again, I think what we need to do is come up with ways to make it easier for, let's say, businesses that need to hire workers, foreign workers, to make sure, that they're not jobs that Americans would otherwise take, right? I mean, I think that, this is an important discussion in the United States we have to have, which is, what does it mean to say that Americans won't do this work? And, maybe the wages are artificially low in some of these areas. But again, I think, it seems clear that we do need some level of foreign workers. And I think what we need to do is improve the ways to have people come legally and crack down on the illegal. I mean, nobody should be in favor of illegal migration. I mean, those are people who are not protected by our laws. I find it strange that people who consider themselves progressives would not be concerned about people who are living in the shadow of the law. I mean, we have workforce laws, OSHA, all kinds of laws in this country to protect people. But if you're here illegally, you're not going to get the benefit of these protections. And that's very troubling to me. One of the things about the Bracero program that was interesting is that these people were earning Social Security. And in fact, when the program ended in the 60s, the United States gave the Mexican government a lump sum of money to put in a trust fund to pay ongoing Social Security benefits to these people. We passed that to Mexico. And that was one of the fideicomisos that existed until just now. Again, I think the question really is about legal versus illegal migration. And I think one other thing we should keep in mind that migration has changed in recent years, and we are now seeing, very, very large numbers of non-Mexicans crossing over the border, trying to enter the United States over the southern border. This, I think, creates lots of opportunities for cooperation, because I would think Mexico has no interest in being a doormat for people trying to enter the United States illegally from other countries. But, we're seeing, tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people entering Mexico, from all over the world: Haiti, Cuba, Brazil, Ecuador, Congo, Bangladesh, India, China. And so the issue has taken on a really kind of United Nations dimension. And I would think the U.S. and Mexican governments, should be able to cooperate. We certainly did in the last administration about deterring people from entering Mexico illegally to try to get into the United States illegally across that border. I just don't think it benefits anybody to have a border that is out of control. And I think, unfortunately, this narrative of, we're going to be very, kind, it sounds great, but I think that the problem is a lot of these people are themselves being victimized. I mean, these are very poor people. They're paying thousands of dollars that they don't have. I think they're to smugglers, basically. And so the people who are getting rich off of this are largely human smugglers. You don't get across northern Mexico, without some kind of payoff to these, criminal gangs that control really these migration access points to the United States. So, I am very troubled by, any policies that are incentivizing this kind of, unregulated flows of people. And I'm afraid now this issue has gotten so politicized in the United States that, I'm not sure I see a way forward on progress, but I think there are common sense solutions there for those who choose to look for them.
Thank you, Chris. Yes, Daisy, you want to read the last one before we give the floor? Do we have one time for another question, Renee?
We do. I think so. You can go ahead.
Okay. And there's a comment also. Just go ahead, Daisy.
Yes, there is this comment from Ambassador Diana Lady Dugan, and she says, "Look forward to getting together when we are both back in DC. Meanwhile, you've hit on the most difficult issue on security in Mexico. Are there any bilateral private sector coordination or collaboration on this issue? And if so, do they have any standing with AMLO?"
I do think security, and I made this point in Mexico as ambassador, that without security, I don't see economic development. I don't think you can talk about those issues separately, because nobody is going to want to invest in Mexico if they don't have confidence in the security situation. Now, I think Mexico has a story to tell on security. I think sometimes it gets exaggerated in the foreign press, but these issues are not made up. There are real security issues in Mexico, and I think there are different layers of security issues. There's the kind of out and out, narco issues with the drug trade, but there's also a lot of kind of petty criminality of, theft of fuel oil, the huachicol, and and hijacking trucks and kidnappings. And I think Mexico has made some progress in that. Certainly the United States has offered Mexico a lot of assistance, but Mexico certainly has work to do, I think, on fixing up its own criminal justice system. One of the statistics that is very discouraging is that I think more than 90% of crimes are not even reported. People don't even make kind of the initial demanda. I think people just kind of think that it's not worth it, or that maybe somebody in power is somehow complicit and they will just get into more trouble. And so, if you start from that place, it's very difficult to create a feeling of security. I mean, ultimately, the rule of law is very important. Unfortunately, that's not something that you can turn a switch. That has a lot to do with cultural attitudes, and it was a priority of mine to try to focus on those issues and see what we could do to be helpful to the Mexicans. But ultimately, the Mexicans, we can't want it more than the Mexicans. The Mexicans, seems to me, have to demand their own, strengthened rule of law systems.
Daisy?
Thank you for that. We have one last question from Jaime Chico Pardo. And he says, Ambassador Landau, you are absolutely correct in your appraisal. But my belief is that energy supply is fundamental in the new world, and the current Mexican government initiative would be very disruptive to the great opportunities you have outlined.
I hear that. I mean, look, particularly as ambassador, even now as an ex-ambassador, I'm very cautious not to get involved in Mexican domestic political issues. I think as a foreigner, there's limits to what we can or should do. But certainly I can observe that, the perceptions regarding investment in Mexico, I think, are negative right now. And I think that is largely due to these headlines that keep coming out in the energy sector. So again, Mexico certainly has a sovereign right to make the decisions it wants, but it seems to me that I would hope that these moves they're making in the energy sector doesn't wind up destroying the opportunities for investment in Mexico across the board, even in other sectors. But again, I think that's the Mexican government's decision.
Thank you, Chris Landau, for being so candid, for sharing your thoughts with us. And thank you. And we can tell that once ambassador to Mexico City, always interested and in love with the country. Thank you for your keen interest and passion for Mexico and U.S.-Mexican relations. Daisy, thank you very much for being with us, for help us field the questions to Ambassador Landau. And Renee Bowen, back to you.
Well, thank you so much, Rafael and Ambassador Landau. I cannot thank you enough. That was such a stimulating discussion. I think you've given us a lot to think about over the next 2 days as we have our conference on USMCA and global supply chains. You touched on pretty much every important topic, except for environment. But we will certainly, that's a whole different conversation in itself. But we really want to thank you for your candidness today. I do have to give another thank you to Rafael for his partnership in bringing this together with the Center for U.S.-Mexican Studies, my team at CCD, at the Center for Commerce and Diplomacy, especially Fabienne Perlov, our new project director, and the Associate Director, Lawrence Blows, and of course, Kyle Handley. Simeng Zhang, and so many others that need to be mentioned. But this has been a really great undertaking, and we're looking forward to the next 2 days of events. Thank you for being a great kickoff speaker.
My pleasure. Thanks for the invitation. And
on
this. It's one of the things about Mexico and the United States is I think it's almost unique in the world in terms of a foreign relationship that has a direct impact on the prosperity and security of Americans. And I think vice versa in Mexico. So, it's kind of hackneyed now to be talking about it being an intermestic relationship, but I do think it sits right at the border of, right at the crossroads of domestic and foreign affairs. And I believe so strongly that getting this relationship right is crucial to the security and prosperity of both countries. So thanks to all of you for focusing on these issues.
Thank you, Ambassador Landau.